Hello and welcome to TheHill's Digital Health podcast. TheHill is the digital health transformation catalyst based at Oxford University Hospitals. We're working to help the NHS make the most of digital innovation. We do this in three ways. We work with innovators to help them develop their digital health ideas and products and make them relevant to the National Health Service. We work with clinical teams to understand needs, engage them in digital innovation, increase digital skills, and adopt innovation. And finally, we collaborate with many partners, bringing together multiple organisations to form a digital health ecosystem. This podcast series focuses on clinical entrepreneurs, our clinical colleagues who have decided to start a business or a social enterprise to develop a digital health innovation. My name is Megan Morys-Carter, Director of TheHill, and I'm joined today by Zeeshan Akhtar, Specialist Registrar at Oxford University Hospitals. Zeeshan has a DPhil in surgical sciences and set up, led and exited from his healthcare startup, Scout Health. And we're now delighted to have him as a mentor on the new Market Access Accelerator programme starting this year. Zeeshan, welcome. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Could you start off by telling us a little bit more about Scout Health and what it was supposed to do?
So Scout Health was an app that was designed really to try and help people improve their overall health. It aimed to be a preventative healthcare app that looked at providing people with insights into their risk profile for developing disease and then helping them to monitor and track their health using blood testing.
Fantastic. Yeah. So tackling a really huge problem for the health service, really.
Yeah, that's right. So we were looking at kind of a number of different disease processes, but predominantly the big ones that cause problems like, for example, cardiovascular disease and diabetes.
You've now exited Scout Health and gone back to clinical practice. So can you talk us through a little bit of that journey? How long did the whole process take from having that idea right through to exiting, and what were the key stages of that business?
So the initial concept was developed in 2016 and then actually started the company in 2017 and then really worked on it for about two and a half years or so, I would say overall. That was the kind of time frame that it took. And through that sort of 2.5 year windows, it must have gone through 10 or more iterations of exactly what it was. And I think that whenever you come up with an idea that you're trying to test, you never quite appreciate how the market's going to respond to that. And so for us, it was a very long journey with numerous failures, numerous having to restart, numerous worrying points that led to the end of it. But we really had to go through multiple iterations of defining exactly what we were doing and how we were doing it. And really, the first time we started doing it was actually physically in person for people. So it wasn't a digital health app at that stage. It was a concept around providing people with sort of preventative healthcare advice in so-called pods. And we were initially called Pod Health, and we were going around literally in physical pods and providing health advice to people. And I think that was the exciting element of it. And then we kind of introduced blood work for patients so they could have their blood tests done and have reports delivered back to them, and then ongoing advice and support. And then that kind of we realized that wasn't scalable to do what we were doing, but wanted to do it in a scalable way. And then we decided that we were going to do it through an application process. We raised funding and we were able to kind of get it through that stage and get a product out there that was used and was, I think, helpful to many people. And so, yeah, it was something that we were very proud of in the end.
I think you've done a great job there, Zeeshan, of kind of illustrating the different stages that a startup goes through, and the importance of having a sort of minimum viable product, getting something out there, working out how the market responds to it, and then adapting to suit.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually probably one of the biggest lessons that I learned, was how important those early phases are to test your idea. And, I was just speaking to an entrepreneur last week about it, and we were talking about his concept, which is just, it's just on, at the moment, it's just on a piece of paper. And he was thinking about, how do I take this forward and what do I do with this and how can I test it? And was thinking about spending thousands of pounds on websites and things. And I was kind of like, actually, there's oftentimes free, easy, cheap ways to bootstrap and test your idea. And we went through some of those. And I think now, knowing what I know, I think the key thing whenever you're kind of starting to go out is to try and bootstrap as far as possible and test your hypotheses as soon as possible, because your assumptions will almost certainly be wrong in some respect. And it's about finding that product market fit, and you really need to work on that, and that really needs to be part of your plan, to be kind of, but this is what I learned anyway, to be more kind of flexible about how you take things forwards, and putting securities and contingencies in place so that you can deal with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you say, sort of that iteration with your customer and with the market you're trying to serve, and sort of understanding how you alter the product to fit that. But also, you know, how as a founder, you do have a vision for what you're trying to achieve and kind of what problem you're trying to solve. And the market can't tell you everything, I guess.
No, and that's the difficult part, because you have a place you want to get to, you know, and it might be something very futuristic you want to achieve. And how much do you kind of have the grit to kind of go in that direction versus responding to what actually the market wants? And there's a balance to be struck there, I think. And perhaps on occasions I was a bit too bloody minded about where I wanted to go, and I didn't respond to the market early enough or well enough, I think, or we didn't, I should say. And but you know, that's a learning process as well, and I think every company will be going through that, and there'll be some very famous examples of where people started and where they ended up, you know.
Yeah, it's a great tension that exists for most entrepreneurial companies. I think, you know, how much are you market led and customer led, and how much do you listen to your customers versus how much do they not really know what they want and what could be achieved for them, with your vision.
I think there is a balance to be struck, because I think that, you know, you if you can understand that somebody is willing to either spend time, input data, or even give you money for a service or a product that you're providing, and that may not be an individual, it obviously may be an organization, or for many companies relevant to TheHill, it might be the NHS. Actually, you need to understand what it is their pain point is, because as soon as you start to address that, then you're really making something that's super valuable, and then you can evolve it into what you see as you being your vision in the future. But oftentimes for that first year, 2 years, 5 years, it's about a company staying alive, of course, and sometimes it's accepting that you have to respond to the market and provide what they need right now. Well, that's my opinion.
Well, absolutely. It's your opinion that we're after, Zeeshan. So that's fantastic. And I think there are lots of ways of going about this, but clearly, you know, the approach that you've taken has been successful, and you've managed to get to an exit, which is fantastic. What was the hardest part of that whole journey for you, do you think?
I think it was dealing with failure, actually. And I think as physicians, and particularly physicians who are, you know, I've been through the system, like many people I'm sure who've been through TheHill, and we're not taught to fail, actually, as clinicians. And so on the journey, you know, you're going to have experiments that are running, essentially, that you are looking at and thinking, okay, is this going to be successful? And you'll have stakeholders, you know, your investors, your team members, your co-founders, all of whom are you know, you're trying to keep going in one direction. And I think perhaps the hardest part that we're not prepared for as clinicians is how you respond to failure, when something doesn't work, when, you know, the finances don't work out, when you have to let go of people, or when, you know, the people aren't working out, actually, you know, your team members aren't right for where you're taking things. And so that for me was the hardest part of the journey. And for me, it was the dealing with that sense of not necessarily self-disappointment about how things are not working out the way you envisaged. And that happened more frequently than, you know, things working out the way you thought they would. They never ever do that. They always go slightly differently. And so I personally feel as though that was the hardest part, getting over that. But I also would say, and this is with retrospect, of course, that it was also the point at which I learned the most, is those points where you failed, where things didn't work out. And certainly that's made me a better clinician, actually. It's made me better, I think, as a person. But if you told me that at the time, I would have told you to get lost, because it felt terrible.
Yeah, I think it's probably something that is difficult for innovation in the NHS as a whole, really, because, you know, ultimately, as a caring organisation that has to treat patients and doesn't want to fail ever, doesn't want to ever have an issue with a patient, or kind of, do the wrong thing for them, or have that not be the best experience, then it can be quite difficult, I think, to accept that in the world of innovation, you do have to fail sometimes. You do have to try stuff. You do have to perhaps push the boat out a bit, and it doesn't matter if you fail, you just learn from that. And that's a difficult lesson to learn, I think.
It's a difficult lesson to learn, especially when, your time's at stake, actually, and people's investments are also in stake here. You do feel that pressure, and it's right to feel that pressure, actually, because I think that's what's required sometimes to just push things forward, but it's not an easy process to go through.
So why did you decide to start a business?
Well, several reasons, really. I was motivated by a patient in this particular circumstance, but actually, well, not to start a business, but to start the concept, I would say. And then actually I thought, okay, well, how do I get this to become sustainable? Because, and how do I get it to grow, and how do I get it to become valuable in its own rights? And that's really how it kind of led to a startup route. And I come from a family of entrepreneurs as well. So it's really, I felt like it's always been in my blood a bit to do some entrepreneurial work. So, I was surrounded by family members and others saying, yeah, go for it. And I'd seen my uncles and my dad always take those types of risks in their life with starting up new ventures, starting up new ideas. And I kind of sort of romanticized it a bit, actually, to be honest with you. So I felt like it was something I always wanted to do, and I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to do.
You mentioned, obviously, that you're back in clinical practice and that potentially the experience has made you a better clinician. What has the experience brought for you personally, and how has it changed you?
I think, I think it's made me more acutely aware about some of the issues that are in the NHS. Now I look at finances differently, having run a company, having understood balance sheets, having understood sort of the financial aspects of running a business. Now I understand also how it is important for the NHS, what's important. I think as a clinician, you're generally protected from that because you're constantly concerned about patient care, which is right. But now I kind of understand the bigger picture, and I feel like I can have a more informed discussion with colleagues about that. And that, I think, makes me a better rounded physician, doctor as well. I think also just the team management skills, the management to lead, the management to kind of understand some social aspects as well about people and what they are. I think you get a very different insight when you're in a small startup that is vulnerable, very highly vulnerable from financial pressures, about people's home circumstances, about how that influences them, so forth and so on. I think I've taken that experience, being able to bring it back to the NHS. And of course, the other thing, of course, is it's from every one of the failures that we had, I learned something from that, and I learned how to cope as well. And so, if things don't work out, for an exam, or things don't work out with a patient for whatever reason, I think that I am now better equipped to kind of deal with the failures that may happen in my career.
Yeah, so you've developed a bit of resilience that's perhaps useful in lots of different areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would agree with that.
I remember meeting you fairly early on in your journey and being really impressed by your team and the group of people that you've brought together to develop Scout Health. How did you go about assembling that team?
They were all people I knew, and I kind of been making a mental list of people who I thought would just be fantastic in a startup environment, and what particular roles and what particular elements they could or could not bring in. And they were all fantastic, and I just wanted to make sure that I wanted to give the company the best chance of success, and that was always going to be with a good team of people. And sometimes you look back and you think, okay, well, where could have things been strengthened up? Where could have, what were the deficits in what we did? And I find it difficult to think of anything that could have been different in terms of the quality of people we had around us, because they were so good. And I think that gave us a head start. And I think it made us do more with less, actually. With less finances, I think we were able to do more. And so for me, that was the big benefit of having such a highly qualified team around me.
Some people would say it's quite difficult to set up a company with your friends and family, though. I mean, that's quite a challenge, isn't it? Having those relationships already. Yeah,
that's true. Although I didn't find it a challenge, in all honesty. I think that we all worked really well together. There is, but there were other people who weren't friends and family, of course, and they were no one was family, in fact. But there were people who were there who were not part of the founding group, who weren't kind of friends, there were points where we had disagreements, and there were points where, like, of course, some of those were quite heated disagreements. But I think you always put things in the context of this being a business, in the context of this being a startup, in the context of, and that is something that is challenging to do. And I think I learned to do that over time, and I'm still learning how to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to some extent the relationships you build up with your team help you to then have those difficult conversations, don't they? Because you know each other well enough to be able to trust each other and be able to have the constructive conflict about that particular issue rather than making it personal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's absolutely right. And also the difficult decisions, so I remember having a conversation with someone we had to let go, and actually that person was fantastic at their job. And I think she could tell from the way I was talking to her that it really pained me to let her go. And I think that she made it easier for me. It almost was the other way around. She was counselling me in the end about it. And it's a testament to people, actually, how resilient they are and how much they can take on and how they respond to adversity. And I think for me, that made working with these group of people amazing.
You obviously did a good job of it too, Zeeshan. I often advise founders to think about what their long-term goal is when they get into these ventures. How long they plan to stay in the business, when and how they want to exit. Did you make a plan like that at the beginning, and did it work out as you expected?
No, it didn't work out as I expected, and the goal was never to exit. Really, I didn't even know what the concept of exiting really meant. And an exit really is, a number of different things. It's basically you trying to define where does the company go from here. And that could even be dissolving the company at the end. It could even be selling it on. It could be selling the IP, or it could be doing any number of different things. And I remember being approached very early on by an investor who asked me, what is the exit strategy for the company? And at the time, I didn't really know, and I didn't give them a proper answer. And now I think it's probably one of the most critical things you can think about is throughout your journey, even from day one, when you sit down with that piece of paper and you write down your idea, it's like, okay, where is this going to go, and how is it going to be different throughout the lifetime of this business? And so your exit strategy you may have an exit strategy at 3 months, you may have one at 6 months, you may have one at 12 months, you may have one at 10 years. And so I think it's really important to just be considered about that and look at what your options are at every single stage, and look at the competitive landscape and say, okay, well, am I going to become attractive enough for a competitor to move into, or do I need to make my company as attractive to several potential sort of buyers at the end? Because that's a key element of things going forward. So I definitely, if I was to do this again, I think I'd be much more meticulous about considering what the options are for the business at every single stage, and for me personally as well. Because at some point, that it does get hard being a founder and leading a startup, and you may decide that actually the opportunity cost is too great as well. And so you need to make those provisions whenever you're planning.
Yeah, I think it's particularly true of a lot of our clinical colleagues who, perhaps really love their clinical work and don't really want to give that up, and then find themselves actually taking on something that is really a full-time job, running a startup, and have the dilemma of, well, what do I do next?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that as medics as well, I think that we are very lucky to work in such a professional, structured environment. And I certainly miss that in the startup world, because everything is chaos and everything is unordered and everything is last minute and everything is just problem solving. And I miss to some extent the structure, at least, of my day. And I understand there's a lot of problem solving in medicine, but the structure of my day was relatively well sought after, and the demand is always high for medics, especially I think right now. And so there's I miss that certainty, and that's really what I felt as though partly what drew me back to medicine, but I also missed the day-to-day work of what I do here.
What sort of support did you have whilst you were developing the startup, and how was that useful?
We had lots of support, really. In some ways, sometimes I felt like we had too much support. We had so much support, from, obviously we had great support from TheHill. We had great support from the Foundry, which is, as well. And we had mentors and investors and people who were just generally nice to us. I think we were, as a startup group, I think we were pretty likable, and I think that most of us had industry experience as well, and we brought in friends and contacts from the industry world as well who were very kind to us and help us achieve more with less. So yeah, we were extremely well supported, and I would definitely say to people who are going into the startup world is that mentorship is incredibly important, because it'll help you. It will provide you with not only advice, but it would also provide you with that ability to continue in the face of failure, because someone's going to just say to you that, don't worry, I've been through this circumstance before and I got through it. And that's probably one of the most critical things.
I think it's one of the things that we've certainly heard from our Market Access Accelerator alumni is one of the more valuable things about any sort of accelerator program is that sort of mentorship and that kind of finding people who've done it before or are a few steps ahead of you, who are the people who can really sort of empathize with where you're sat and get through that. So that's why we're so delighted to have you coming back as a mentor, Zeeshan. That's fantastic.
I'm delighted to be part of this process. I obviously benefited massively from it, and got to meet some great people through the process as well. So yeah, it's fantastic.
So coming back to the sort of the career pathway that involves starting a company and then going back into the NHS, I mean, how did starting a company fit with your DPhil, your clinical training, all the other things that you've done as part of your career, and what did that look like for you?
Well, I was already partway through my higher surgical training at the time, and I'd already completed a DPhil, and I'd started the company already. So I'd already just started the company, and we'd been going for about 12 months or so. And, it was really becoming a lot of work. And I kind of had to make the decision, do I leave my career? What do I do with my surgery career, which I love so much? And what do I do with this idea that I can't seem to get out of my head as well? And, was very enthusiastic about and very committed to. And I was lucky in that my program directors were very supportive of the idea, the concept, and I think to some extent proud of where I'd taken it to at that point. And, encouraged me to take time out from surgery to kind of continue with it. And so I was awarded a sort of out of program experience to run the company full time for 1 year to see how things went, basically. And that gave me that 1 year window, and also a nice time frame, I think, to kind of really suck and see whether this was a lifestyle that I wanted to be part of, or whether the company was going to be successful. And I think that was helpful. And then I was able to rejoin the clinical pathway actually in a year's time, which is exactly what I did. And at that stage, we had kind of drawn a line into where we were going to go and how we were going to exit and how things were going to move forward. So actually, the timing worked out really well for me, serendipitously from my career perspective. But I know that generally speaking, that there is much more support now for entrepreneurs within the NHS. The NHS obviously NHS entrepreneurs are being supported to come up with new ideas. And so I think that generally speaking, especially if you've got an idea that's shown some initial traction whilst you're already working, I think that most program directors would be looking at you favorably, thinking, okay, well, this is a really interesting thing. How do we support this person continuing to some extent with their medical training whilst exploring this endeavour?
So what are your final pieces of advice then, Zeeshan, for those clinical staff members that are out there thinking of pursuing an idea? What would you say to them?
I would encourage them to do it. I think it's a fantastic opportunity, especially if you've got an idea, and there's no better place to come up with ideas than within the NHS. I think there's so many issues that need tackling, and there's so many problems that need solving. So I really believe that clinicians are very, very well placed to try and deal with those issues, and to build startups to try and do that. It is a monstrous process, especially if you really want to go the full length. So it's not to underestimate that process, but also to understand that there are smaller goals and targets that you can achieve that don't necessarily require you to give up your clinical practice. And that's either by getting other people involved that are more experienced in business, or or alternatively actually selling your idea at an early stage. I can give the example of a colleague of mine who developed some novel concept that he then patented and then developed a prototype for, and then he sold the prototype and the patents to a company. So he actually never left clinical practice, but was able to get an exit very early on. So there's multiple ways to look at this thing, and it's exciting and it's interesting and it's different. And I think even if your concept is not going to work out long term, I think you as a person will be enriched for it and will carry it forward forever. So I would definitely recommend it.
I think that's a great place to end, Zeeshan, because I think you're right. You've brought up a couple of really good points there around, that there is no one size fits all model for entrepreneurship. You can think about a short-term exit. You can think about a longer term investment into a company. You can think about simply licensing the IP somewhere. There's lots of different options. So wanting to continue clinical practice or wanting to do other things is not a barrier to developing these ideas and making sure that someone benefits from them. And also then that idea that I think it really does develop you as a person to experience the world of entrepreneurship, the kind of fast moving chaos, I think, as you described it, and the kind of, the need to firefight all the time, but also the need to drive something forward and find the right product market fit and challenge yourself to really come up with something that solves someone's problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Zeeshan, thank you ever so much for joining us on the podcast. It's been really great to have you.
Thank you. No, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Hills podcast, and in particular our series on clinical entrepreneurs. And today we had Zeeshan Akhtar, Specialist Registrar at Oxford University Hospitals, former founder of startup Scout Health, and also a mentor on TheHill's Market Access Accelerator programme.